Welcome everybody to day 3 of Open Education Bootcamp 2024. We're so glad you could join us today, and we're really glad that Dr. Catherine Cronin could also join us. I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. We're hosting this bootcamp on Treaty 4 lands, the traditional territory of the Nayoak, Anishinaabeg, Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota First Nation, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. I'm personally grateful as I have lived and learned and grown and raised my family here as a guest from Treaty 8. I've been provided with opportunities to learn about our shared histories here and to participate in reconciliation, and I'm really grateful for those things. I'm going to ask Dr. Joyce Macbeth now to introduce our speaker, and she will also be moderating the questions.
Thanks, Shauna. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Catherine Cronin, who's visiting us today from Galway, Ireland. Thanks to the awesomeness of the internet, we can get people from a long way away now, which is wonderful. Before I give my introduction for Catherine, I should say I am joining this call from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, and I'm grateful to the people who traditionally reside here, the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations for the privilege of living and working in this space. Catherine is an independent and open scholar based in Galway, Ireland, who is a champion for social justice in open education. Catherine co-edited the recently published open access book, Higher Education for Good, Teaching and Learning Futures, with Laura Chernovich, who is a professor emerita at the University of Cape Town, South Africa. Catherine's academic background includes a PhD in open education from the National University of Ireland, Galway, an MA in Women's Studies in Gender and Technology, an MEng in Systems Engineering, and a BSc in Mechanical Engineering. So she's really got a very broad background that she brings to her resource generation and teaching perspectives. She recently served for 3 years on Ireland's National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, where she led efforts to enhance and support use of digital and open education in Ireland. She's been involved in teaching research and advocacy in higher education and more broadly for over 35 years. And she regularly contributes to collaborative projects and conversations in the areas of digital, open, and higher education within Ireland and globally. This co-edited book that I mentioned, Higher Education for Good, includes insights from scholars around the world on issues in higher education and paths forward to create more just, humane, and globally sustainable learning environments. It's a collection of inspiring work that's highly relevant to us here in Saskatchewan, I believe. We have a community here of scholar teachers who sincerely strive to make change in terms of reconciliation efforts with Indigenous peoples of this land and in our own efforts to support our diverse student population who are increasingly struggling with challenges, including finances, caregiving, and health concerns. And this book and the insight Catherine can share with us today are inspiring for our own efforts to prepare thoughtful and creative approaches to empower our students to learn. Thank you, Catherine, for all that you do, and welcome. And we are really looking forward to hearing more from you today. And I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Joyce and Shauna. What a very kind introduction. And I just noticed the sun has just gone down here, so I now have this very dramatic lighting, but I'll share my slides, so hopefully you can look at the slides instead of me. And thanks to everyone who's here, a few people that I know, and I'm sure some people that I don't. So welcome, everybody. I will share my screen. Now, is that visible there?
Yep,
yes.
We can see that just fine.
Fantastic, thanks. I'm just rearranging my screen so that I can see the chat as well, because I'm just going to give you a couple of opportunities to respond during the presentation, and I'll end well before our end time so that we can have a discussion, because I'm keen to learn from you as well. So thank you, of course, for the invitation to share ideas. I'll share some ideas, and as I said, I really look forward to hearing from you about using open educational practices and about open education for good, as I will call it in the presentation. I'm connecting with you from Galway in Ireland. There's a little map. I checked this morning. I was just curious, and it's 6,084 kilometers between our two places, Regina and Galway, which is about 3,800 miles or so. So, I mean, that's interesting as a point of geography, but I also just want to say it as a reminder that, I'll be speaking from my, particular cultural standpoint, institutional knowledge, here in Ireland. So I just want to share it with that qualification, and, we'll see how that reflects with your practice in your context. I will be referencing a lot of work by many different scholars. So I will maybe just add this link to the chat. And there's a QR code there that should work. If it doesn't, I put the link here in the chat. So these are just a link to my slides. And as I said, if there's anything that you want to follow up on in more detail or whatever, I invite you just to do that there. And of course, the slides themselves are an OER, licensed with a CC by NC license. So I'm really curious just about you all. So a few people have put their names in the chat, but if anybody would like to just say a couple of words about how you're doing today. It's 4:30 in the afternoon for me. I think it's morning for you if you're in Canada, but if you want to just say hello, I'd love to hear how you are before we get started. Excited, Shauna. Thank you. Jen, nice to meet you. Oh, a long weekend. Wonderful. Coffee. Okay, I've got my water, Robert. Joyce, thank you. Oh, Susan from San Antonio. Nice to meet you. Saskatoon. Hi, Donna. Please feel free to continue. I'll get started in the next couple of seconds, but the chat is open and please chat with each other. I won't be following it closely during the presentation, but happy for the moderators to pick up questions that I can address afterwards. So thanks, everyone. So in terms of how I've divided up the presentations, I spoke with Shauna a bit before this event just to make sure that this was in sync with what you're doing as part of the Open Education Bootcamp. So I have just a few slides giving kind of an introduction about really the context that we're all operating in, the issues to which the open education and higher education community responds in our work, wider than what we do in our job descriptions, but just globally what we respond to, because not only do we respond to these issues, but we in higher education can respond to and guide and change society itself, of course. And then the three main sections are, I'll talk about the book, Higher Education for Good. I'll look at that through the lens of open education. And then the final section is just about making some connections between open education and higher education for good. And then hopefully ending on a note of hope before we all leave each other today. So in terms of that introduction and context, I think this is really where we have to start. And this word polycrisis has been used recently. And this lovely image by Niamh McCardle is about a polycrisis in a fragmented world. And the definition of polycrisis is just that each crisis impacts on and magnifies the others. So again, much more broadly than open education and even than higher education, the kinds of things that we need to consider are just deepening and intersecting inequality. Research has shown that while inequalities between countries has declined in recent years, it has increased within countries to a great extent. There's the climate crisis, of course. When in 2023, we exceeded 1.5 degrees of warming on average for the first time. The climate crisis, again, is connected to inequality. 10% of the world's population reportedly accounts for 48% of CO2 emissions. So these are interlinked and magnify one another. In addition to that, of course, there's conflict, polarization, authoritarianism, and wars. the democracy index is decreasing worldwide year on year. And of course, we're still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that is just really important context, I think, for everything that we're talking about. And then, of course, there's just the digital, the water we all swim in. Maria Ressa, who is the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize winner, talks about big tech as the connective tissue of society, which is just such an evocative way, I think, to think about it, and talks about these connections almost at the cellular level, no matter what our engagement with the digital might be. So it affords us so much, but there are also some things that we need to be very cognizant of. And that one of those is, for example, that, government control of the internet is a reality in many countries. In 2022, there were 187 internet shutdowns across 35 countries. And thinking of our situation in the open education community and the open movement more generally, we're often constrained by the closed platform infrastructures that we encounter in the digital world. And I'll talk more about that in the presentation. Also, in terms of this overall context, how can we not talk about the dramatic and recent mainstreaming of AI into all aspects of society, not just education? It reflects the world. Many people are using it within higher education, within other areas of life to facilitate work, but because it reflects the world, it's also biased. So Emily Bender talks about the fact that AI and certainly the outputs of large language models skew hegemonic. And, there are many people writing about various forms of algorithmic bias that are evident in AI. There are also forms of human harm that we need to be aware of. So the contributions to the climate crisis of AI and the exploited labor in the creation of AI models, which tend to marginalize those most at risk. So these issues matter because open education is about more than just access, of course. It's about inclusion in education and moving towards human rights and democracy. And finally, in terms of the overall context, I don't think I need to say much about this, but it's well documented, the underfunding and defunding of higher education globally. And that is certainly something that came out in our book, which I'll present in a second. The culture of the market is very much embedded in the higher education sector through practices, but also through discourse and culture. And we know what that looks like. It looks like staffing cuts, the growth of an academic precariat, rising costs for students, resource restrictions, and so much more. So we need to ensure that digital transformation, I think, isn't just about outsourcing digital infrastructure. And activity tracing, for example. So we want to be cognizant of the risks and make the most of what's possible. So that brings us to higher education for good. My co-editor, Laura Czerniewicz, she and I looked at a lot of these issues in mid-2021, and we thought, what can we do? How can we respond to this? So we decided that we would send out an invitation to scholars to respond. And some of the work that had inspired us, particularly in the area of climate justice, was work that not only analyzed the problems, but also identified avenues for action and hope. So we asked scholars to respond in that way. And the outcome was the book Higher Education for Good, which, as it says here, explores what better futures for higher education could look like in the future. Now, the book is openly licensed, and I think I share a QR code later in the presentation. I'll bring Laura into the space that we're in here together, just because she's my co-editor, and we actually collaborated on this presentation because we wanted to represent the project for both of us. She just wasn't able to be here today. So voices are in the book. Well, what is the book all about? So again, we wanted the book to be open. We wanted to be intentionally global and not just easily global, like mostly, the US and North America and Europe, but we wanted it to be diverse, global North, global South, and so on. So that took a lot of effort. We used our networks. We looked at, United Nations and UNESCO networks, and we tried to really have the book represent a truly global authorship. So there are 71 authors from about 18 countries in the book. And we worked as a community of authors and artists to create the book. So the various authors shared their drafts with one another. They reviewed one another's work, as well as being outside peer reviewed. And many of them have gone on to collaborate, after the book's publication. The book was published by Open Book Publishers, which is, I must say, a brilliant open publisher based in the UK at the University of Cambridge. There were no charges to us as editors nor to the authors. And, the book was, professionally peer reviewed and marketed and so on. And we're really grateful to Open Book Publishers. We sent them our proposal, it was reviewed, and once they agreed to publish it, they worked with us closely through the whole process. I won't go through a lot of detail on this, but I just want to let you know there are 27 chapters in the book. Shauna, I think you mentioned at the start about, Indigenous open education. There are a couple of chapters that deal with this. I'm just going to call them out now. Chapter 15, Vulnerability and Generosity, The Good Future for Australian Higher Education by Kate Bowles. And there is another book, Why Decolonizing Knowledge Matters, by Dina Belluigi. And I might think of another when we're in the discussion phase, but there are several chapters in the book that deal with design justice, Indigenous knowledges, and more. The other thing that may interest you about the book is that because this was not an academic journal, we were creating the vehicle, we were creating the form of the book, as well as its content. So we invited authors to submit their chapters in whatever form was meaningful for them. So there are critical reflections, examples of reflective practice, poetry, some written in the form of dialogue. There's a visual chapter, and many of the chapters have visuals. And the authors we gave them license to communicate as they wish. And we found that many people really have responded to that notion of multiple genres, including artwork. There are all these 27 chapters plus 5 examples of artwork created for the book. The book is an OER, of course. There's the QR code for the book. So the entire book is an OER, and each individual chapter is an OER. So we wanted to give people the opportunity to share maybe just the one chapter or 2 chapters that resonate with them. It's a big book. Not all of the chapters might be relevant for your context. And people have done this. They've used chapters in their teaching, in their professional development workshops, and so on. So the book can be used, reshared, remixed in lots of interesting ways. So that's a little bit about higher education for good. That's what it's all about. And now what I'd like to do is just segue into considering open education with that lens. And I know a lot of you are already working in open education, so I'll go quickly through this because in section 3, I'm going to combine the 2 things, higher education for good and open education. So can I just ask you to put 1, 2, 3 words, just something really brief in the chat, if you want to, about what you think of when you hear the term open education, just to get a sense of where you are. And again, don't feel compelled to do this, but if you'd like to, I invite you to use the chat. Inclusion, free access, accessibility, free, flexible, accessible, for everyone, everywhere. Beautiful. Sharing, copyleft, democracy, values, open, free access, equalizing, flexibility, inexpensive, UN sustainability goals, essential. This is wonderful. Okay, I'll pause there, but still keep writing in there. That's really helpful for me just to get a sense of your perceptions. There are so many definitions of open education in the world. This is one that I like to share. Again, it's not the only definition of open education. It's by Brigitte Vizina and Cable Green from Creative Commons, and this was written in a publication that was published during the pandemic. And I like this because it highlights that it's not a binary, it's not a switch, it's not a short-term fix to a passing problem. It's a long-term solution to ensuring equitable, inclusive access to effective educational resources and learning opportunities. So some of your definitions point to this as well, about knowledge as a public good, the values of sharing, participation, equity, co-creation, and really, as Audrey Waters says, the ethics of care and justice, underlining it all. So the things we usually talk about, obviously, are OER, Open Educational Resources. Everyone's very familiar with this. Open Educational Practices, or OEP, which overlaps very much with open pedagogy. Just as education isn't about content alone, open education isn't about OER alone, but rather what open resources facilitate in terms of teaching and learning. And that's what OEP talks about. And in my conversations about open education, I often talk about these three pillars, that OER and OEP have benefits in three areas. And again, I know you all know this, so I'll go through this really quickly, but this was a big part of our work in the National Forum in Ireland, when our mission was to develop open capabilities across the Irish higher education sector. So in speaking with students, with faculty, with teaching and learning professionals, librarians, we would highlight these three areas. So access is obviously enabling access for all. So students don't have to pay, they don't need to pay, they don't need any access codes, there are no time limits. And not only are we sharing access, we're sharing value across the education sector, but we're sharing it beyond the education sector for people who may never ever access higher education, but we're sharing the resources, particularly in Ireland, from publicly funded higher education institutions with, wider society. Of course, that value is only accessible by some, and we often would talk about this concept of meaningful connectivity by the Alliance for Affordable Internet, which acknowledges the notion of a digital divide. Secondly is the notion of equity. So OER reduces overall costs for students, of course. OER, of course, are available before, during, and after taking a course, and particularly during the pandemic, we in Ireland found that many students were forced to take breaks in their studies. So if they would lose access then to institutional email, access to their library, and so on. So OER, surpassed that. They're available during all those breaks, after students graduate, after they finish a course, or during any breaks in study. OER, of course, are also open for editing to address equity, diversity, and inclusion. We've probably all had the experience of teaching with a textbook that really didn't match the people that were in, the space where we were teaching and learning. So we can include perspectives that may be missing and better represent particularly marginalized identities and include students. And then, of course, OER can benefit all and support Sustainable Development Goal number 4, as was mentioned by you here. And finally, pedagogy, open pedagogy. I mean, we could probably spend the whole hour talking about this, and I know a lot of you are already engaged with this, but the notion of, adapting and using OER in context, students co-creating OER, creating various forms of authentic assessment, sometimes called non-disposable or reusable assignments, enabling students to contribute to public knowledge and contribute knowledge in communities that are meaningful to them. And this just amps up and enhances the learning in so many different ways. And by so doing, students develop digital and data literacies, which are so important. So even the concept of learning about open licensing is an important digital literacy. We can diversify the curriculum, and we can enable all sorts of local and global collaboration where we connect students and people, across borders of all kinds. So, I like to think of this aspect of OEP as, what bell hooks talks about as education as the practice of freedom. OEP certainly facilitates that, I believe. So a lot of my work is in the area of critical approaches to open education, which considers the nuances of context, as we've already mentioned, and really focuses, as it says here, on issues of participation and power. So who is in our classrooms and institutions and why? Who is not in our classrooms and institutions and why not? Who is included and excluded when education is opened, kind of really lifting the lid and recognizing that putting an open license on something is not enough. And again, this open is not a binary, that, it's almost like layers of an onion. I just am continually learning how to be, more equitably open in my work. Even now, it's increasingly important, and there's so much to learn. So these questions I just share for just kind of reflection, and perhaps some of you have done work in this area as well. A couple of scholars that I'll mention, Sarah Lambert built on work that was done in the area of social justice around this whole idea of critical approaches to open and social justice approaches. And she asked, whom should openness ultimately serve, and how might openness achieve greater educational and social equality? And she used Nancy Fraser's work, which I'll come back to in the next section, about the various forms of justice that we can use as guides when we're opening our work, whether that's OER, OEP, open publishing, or whatever. I think this is, really a clear and powerful framework for furthering our work in OER. And then, as I mentioned to Shauna and Joyce before we started, I was in Lehman College, which is one of the CUNY institutions, City University of New York, just last week. And they are doing really interesting work about open education and equity pedagogy and open for anti-racism. So they talk about the need for open educators to interrogate and disrupt hegemony through a critical approach to open. So again, highlighting just some work that I think is really valuable in this whole area of critical and social justice approaches to open. When Laura and I looked at open education with this Higher Education for Good lens, we looked at a lot of work globally of people who are really interrogating open. And one great source was Open Future in Europe. And this is from a recent report of Open Futures that found that the open education community is, of course, one of many different opens based on the principles of open, but it's quite siloed from a lot of the other opens, if you like. So open culture, open access, open government, open data, and so on. So this is a worry, I believe, given all the various crises we face that I shared at the start, because surely across all of those open communities, we share concerns, we share many of the same values and commitments, like open licensing. So it's something to be aware of, and I'll mention open access publishing here in that vein. And I mean, again, this is information that I'm sure, very well familiar with, but we think it's worth highlighting. Open access publishing, of course, is to enable research outputs to be accessible to the public without fees, without accounts, without providing information. That's the definition of open access publishing. Today, scholarly publishing is operated by a blend of, it was kind of a continuum of for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. So you have totally closed academic journals, totally open ones, and some all along that continuum. However, the dominant business models are not open, because most of them require author processing charges. That's still the dominant business model. Which is charges to authors to open their work when it's published. And this is inherently inequitable, and in one sense is swapping one form of inequality for another. So swapping subscription paywalls to readers to charges to authors. And research has shown that this tends to exclude authors of, guess what, particular career stages, early career stages, which discriminates by gender, race, institution, and geographic regions. So again, it's a really important and must be visible as a form of inequality. So there are a number of initiatives. I'm sure there are some in Canada. I'm just sharing a couple here from Europe to ensure that open access and open participation are inclusive. And two of these are Coalition S and Plan S, which are, operating, as I said, across Europe, that are trying to align open access policies across kind of institutions and publishers and funders, all in the interest of transitioning to what Europe and the EU continually calls open science, which is open academic publishing in general. And the Council of Europe has defined this transition to open science as ensuring high quality, transparent, open, trustworthy, and equitable scholarly publishing. I'm not sure if I need to go into detail on this, but just these various forms of open access models. Again, for people who are new to open, perhaps you as open advocates may need to lift a lid and describe this kind of thing to them. So green open access is basically self-archiving. So that means, even if you publish in a closed journal, not an open journal, you're enabled to put a preprint or a postprint in your institutional repository. That's something that you have to take an active role in doing, is often supported by librarians, thankfully. And then there's gold open access, where the articles are immediately available on the publication platform as open access, but these still often involve APCs, or author processing charges. And then there's diamond open access, which is what would be in Open Journal, our book, Higher Education for Good, which is immediate open access, no APCs. So there's a lot of diversity across those, and sometimes people need some help understanding those. And so there's a lot of advocacy work going on, particularly by librarians, to facilitate greater and more truly open access. So concluding this section just about considering open education is that the nature of open, in the age of AI, with these very complex publishing models, is under scrutiny. It's complex. There are still extractive business models creating new forms of privatized knowledge concentration. We see that these promises risk positioning tech as the savior once again, quite often with AI, instead of the hard work of developing critical literacies, which we would advocate. So I think, the work that you're doing, this kind of open education boot camp, getting staff, faculty, librarians together, is really important, because open education in this moment in time is such a key dimension in this kind of global social polycrisis that I described, and just central to fighting for equity and human rights and democracy and justice. We have a pathway through our work in open to do that good work. So the final section is about making connections. So how might we make connections between what I described as, this global community of scholars, creating ideas and suggestions for how to create higher education for good, and the current challenges we face in open education. Laura and I wrote an introduction to higher education for good, and I don't know if you can hear my cat. We wrote an introduction which we looked across all 27 chapters, and we tried to pull threads across all of them to see what was common and what were our authors saying kind of at a level above the chapters. And part of our introductory chapter, we wrote about this manifesto for higher education for good. And what we've done here is we've transposed that manifesto for higher education for good to looking at open education. So we've adapted the manifesto. There are 5 tenets, and we really just say here, open education instead of higher education. And again, this is based on the work of 71 authors from the book we published. So what are the 5 tenets? How might we move forward to address the challenges that I've discussed? The first is to name and analyze the troubles of open education rather than ignoring them. Use research, use analysis, communicate it to people in clear ways so that people understand what the issues are in publishing, in open resources, in teaching. Challenge and resist hegemonies, where we're faced, for example, with using many different kind of closed tech platforms. There are some great chapters in the book about challenging and resisting that and using open tools and platforms instead, where that's possible. Borrowing from a lot of great work in social justice, we propose making claims for just, humane, and globally sustainable open education. So it is important to analyze the problems and to challenge and resist, but then we also need to paint clear pictures of what we're moving towards so that we can bring people with us. Then courageously imagine and share fresh possibilities for how we might get there. There's many different ways we can do that, and then make positive changes. There are so many constraints that we all work under, but even in our context, even when we might be working alone, we can make positive changes. So I'll just talk about each of these briefly, and then I'll aim to finish at 1:15 so that we have plenty of time for discussion. So first one, name and analyze the troubles of higher education. So I hope that, what I've described so far, that it's clear that there's no escaping the need to name and confront these numerous challenges that we face, both the open education specific challenges and the wider social and political challenges. So this requires more analysis within open education to see how we are connected, how we are connecting to these wider issues. Of course, always mindful of underfunding and overworking that characterizes higher education and open education. Going back to, as an example of analyzing and illuminating the problems, I'll harken back to work by Nancy Fraser, which is just really seminal work around social justice. She defined social justice as participatory parity, everyone participating equally in society. This is so important in terms of like a fundamental value of open, isn't it? And she identified three dimensions of justice and injustice: economic, cultural, and political. And, you know, a classic example is if you just consider the lack of affordable textbooks. We can go through this list. Economic justice or redistributive justice would be open textbooks, which eliminate costs for students and parents and libraries, so everyone can access the resources. Cultural justice or recognitive justice would be recognizing on top of economic justice that not all geographic areas or groups or knowledges are equally represented. And so we would adapt those open textbooks to include local examples, local issues, case studies, voices, and so on. And another layer, again, is political or representational justice. And that's, again, the layers of the onion, recognizing that only certain groups and individuals in power make decisions about curriculum and about resources. So how might we enable students and faculty to challenge this and give power to those usually seen as subordinate to create perhaps new textbooks together? And moving through these, we're not saying that one of these is not enough, but even if you're engaged at one of these levels, how might you go to the next level? That's what achieving participatory parity would look like. And there are a lot of resources here. I've included one. And, you know, I'd be interested maybe when we're in our discussion, if anybody wants to talk about this in more detail, if you're engaged in creating open textbooks. The second tenet is about challenging and resisting, and knowing that resistance takes courage and that we need to challenge kind of outward forms of injustice, but sometimes we also have to challenge our own power relationships. So, you know, we're often very proud of the fact that, you know, an underlying premise of open is generosity, but generosity can imply unequal power relationships between the giver and the receiver. So sometimes this takes a bit of reflection. So again, resistance outward and resistance to perhaps unhelpful models that we may be holding ourselves. The third tenet, again, you know, arising from other forms of social justice movements, making legitimate and explicit claims to better futures. This is necessary. So we have a particular role and responsibility to contribute to climate justice, algorithmic justice, and so on, and extending open education beyond access to participatory parity. The fourth tenet is courageously imagining and sharing fresh possibilities. So there's a lot of different ways that this can happen, and finding the space and the support to be imaginative can sometimes be difficult when we have so many constraints and time demands on our work. But there's a lot of different ways we can do it. We can cross borders of discipline and, you know, engage with people in other disciplines, cross borders of sector, work with, you know, community groups, people in other education sectors, work across borders of geography. We can, like, as we did in Higher Education for Good, work in alternative genres, again, just to challenge people to think differently, like storytelling, dialogue, poetry, and so on. And Laura and I really believe also that in open education, there's opportunities for different generations to work together. So, you know, there are a lot of people working in open education, myself included, who have been involved for a long time. And other movements for social change, like climate justice, show us that alliances maybe between people with, you know, long experience and people who are younger, whose futures are much longer, and the implications of the work, you know, will go on in their lives for much longer. There can be really productive ways that we should be working together. So another thought just about imagining fresh possibilities. And the fifth tenet is just about the fact that change is possible. And of course, challenges will be expected and opposition might be expected. You know, there are many people who would say, well, why do you want me to share my work? You know, this is my intellectual property, for example. All effective social movements for change contend with resistance, with a plurality of voices. Something that Laura and I mentioned recently in presenting this work was, you know, if we look back to various social justice movements, perhaps in your own context, you know, women's rights movement, the labor rights movement, civil rights movement, and so on, you will often see in retrospect that there was a lot of dissent, people who wanted to work towards legal change, to people who wanted to work towards political change, people who wanted to march in the streets. And sometimes there can be dissent between people who want to work on different parts of the problem. But in retrospect, we often see that all of those forms of work and change were necessary, and that's what achieved success. So it's a challenge for us, you know, working in the here and now in open education, about being open to different ways towards working towards goals that we all agree on, which hopefully are just, humane, and globally sustainable open education. So going back to the 5 tenets, I'm providing a link here to a keynote paper that was authored by Laura and myself, which we ended that keynote paper with several questions for the open education community about how we might move forward based on the 5 tenets. And I won't read through them here. I'll just let you read through those, because again, I want to wrap up by 1:15. I welcome your questions today. There's probably a lot of things that we didn't think of, because you may have unique challenges as well as our collective global challenges. But I think one of the key points is that without doubt, we need to work collectively, you know, across these borders, as I was talking about, and that all the granularity, difference in granularity in our work is important. So, you know, from the tiny leaf to someone who's looking at the whole valley. So if you're helping someone choose the best license for a textbook that they're creating, that is valuable work. If you're working to create an OER policy for your institution, that is important work. You know, if you're seeing how your institution can collaborate and link with other institutions in your region, that is important work. So systemic approaches require all of these different levels. And finally, I did promise that I would end on a note of hope. So we, Laura and myself, in our introduction to higher education for good, put our own stance about hope. We read so much about critical hope, epistemic hope, just hope, radical hope, and in the end, we just wrote our own simple version, which is that we believe that hope is firmly rooted in the belief that it is never too late. Hope is practical. It means taking action, being disciplined, making plans. Hope is impractical. It means dreaming, being undisciplined, being open-ended. Hope is strengthened when practiced in solidarity with others. It means building and strengthening alliances, coalitions, communities. Hope is contested and contradictory, and yet whatever form, it is essential. Without hope, there would be no future worth living. And certainly, you know, after working in the open education field for about 15 years now, this community is definitely where I find hope for my work. So I think it's delighted to be here with you all today and learn from you. And I'll just leave the last word to James Baldwin. For anyone who's familiar with his work, his love for humanity and commitment for justice in really difficult times gave him the will to continue to hope. And hope is invented every day. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a really inspiring talk. And I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, there's a question and answer tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can put in your questions, and then I can either read them out for you, or I'll call on you to unmute and share your question yourself. So yeah, drop your questions in and I'll call you out. Maybe I'll kick things off, Catherine. I really enjoyed your talk. I have a practical question maybe to kick it off. So you'd mentioned Open Publishing in the UK is who you operate with for your publications. Is that just for the digital side of things, or do they also do physical printing of your books for you?
Yeah, they have a print on demand feature. So if you go to the book page, you can access the book electronically. You can download the book electronically, or you can order a printed copy. And so there's a cost for the printed copy, obviously, but it kind of covers their costs. You know, it's a not-for-profit publisher. So they do both.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really good to be aware of. As
So
we,
yes.
oh, yeah,
So that's the book. It's big. It's a bit of a doorstop, but anyway. And
nice.
there's this beautiful image on the front by an artist called George Svougaras, which harkens back to kind of he was inspired by the refugee experience crossing the Mediterranean and just that kind of search for freedom and search for security. So he reflects on that in the book as well.
Beautiful. Yeah, I think we're thinking about international distribution. It's good to identify physical publishers in different countries to make it easier for people to access so they don't have to be, paying a lot for shipping and that. So it's really good to know about a good publisher in the UK. So thank you for that. Yeah. Okay. I have another question. Oh, wait, we've got a question. Fabulous. From Roger Petrie. Roger, do you want it unmute or do you want me to read for you?
It's actually Robert. You can read it.
Oh, okay. Sure.
I have
No
a twin
problem.
brother named Roger, so this happens a lot.
Oh, I'm sorry. I said Roger. Catherine was talking about a Roger in her life earlier. That must be what I said. I'm sorry. All right. So Catherine, could you expand on the hegemony side of things of online tools being used in OER production? Should we be seeking to use tools locally on our computers more often? How important is open source software in OER production these days?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Robert. And again, so much depends on the context that you're in. So for example, in Ireland, there are some universities where there is, active and vibrant support for open book publishing, and they may have a license for a particular platform and so on. So my answer would be different for that university than from someone who's at an institution where, it might be a smaller institution where there's not that support. I think I am more comfortable talking about the openness at the receiving end, because that's something that I think we all share. So regardless of what the platform is, are we sharing in ways that are accessible to all? And are we sharing in ways that are in formats that are editable, or at least provide people with access to formats that are editable to facilitate, remix and reuse, not just reuse as is. Because certainly really embracing that notion of openness and facilitating others to remix our resources to suit the context that they're in is what's very important. There is a chapter in Higher Education for Good written by Tel Emile and Janania do Rosario Diniz, two educators in Brazilian higher education, who talked about their multi-year effort during the pandemic to use open tools with students for learning and also for creating open resources. And that's a real warts and all experience of just how difficult that is, where they found success, where they had challenges. And of course, they're open to communicating with others who might be trying to do something similar. Does that answer your question, Robert?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I have another question here for myself. So a lot of your work has focused on digital access and digital resources. And I'm curious if you could share some thoughts on equity considerations in jurisdictions where people might have limited or imperfect access to digital resources and considerations of equity relating to access to digital resources?
Yeah, that's a great question because, the digital divide is real. And I'm familiar with work done in recent years at the University of Cape Town by Sukaina Walji and Laura Chernowich, again, my co-editor, with remote communities. I think it was around physiotherapy resources that the University of Cape Town had been producing. So there were people who were, there was a kind of spoke in the wheel, someone that got the resources, made hard copies, and then went to those remote communities to share the open resources. So, or sorry, the hub of the wheel. So there was a hub that someone who recognized and had access to the digital OER, and yet met the needs of the remote communities by creating those as physical artifacts that could be shared where there was no digital connectivity. And I just saw something this week that BC Campus has an initiative right now that they're going to be sharing resources about how best to do that. I don't know if anyone else here has seen that or is even involved in that. I just saw it this week on the BC Campus website. But University of Cape Town would certainly be one educational institution that has dealt with this for some time.
I haven't seen that on the BC Campus website, but I'll have to check it out. That's really cool.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, I'm on their mailing list, so I kind of always have an idea about what they're doing. And yeah, I think it was Amanda put it up on LinkedIn this week.
Okay, great. Yeah, sort of a follow-up thought. I was teaching a few years ago, and I had a student who was Indigenous and had a family member who was ill. And so she was doing a lot of driving to visit home. And so she requested a podcast version of my lectures. And it just got me thinking about oral traditions and oral ways of learning and providing recordings to students and recordings of books. And as you're probably aware, if you just have a recording of a book that's just reading it out in the AI voice, it's not very easy to listen to. So is that something that you're looking to do at all with your, I know it's a huge endeavor, but potentially looking to do with your resources as well?
We are, and this, yeah, it's a very timely question because we launched the book in November, December, and people asked about that right away. And, we queried, all our authors, everyone's open to that. One of the 27 chapters is in an audio format already. So this would be for the other 26. So we're currently communicating with all of our authors about how they would like to do that. And the responses are really, really interesting. So, so one author responded and said, of course, I would like to read my chapter. And I can't imagine that anyone in this book would like to use an AI voice, given the topic of the book. And the very next author who replied said, we would love to have our chapter be available as a book, but we have absolutely no support either for the labor or the tech in our particular context. So we would really appreciate it being available using an AI voice, if that technology is available. Another author, again from the Global South, who had done a lot of work around critical tech and digital literacy, said, we really want an audio version of our chapter available, but we don't want our voices to be part of the pool of what's, surveilled by the AI and big tech companies. So we're not going to put our voices online to be part of that. So we would want to use an AI voice, and there are AI voices now, and for all regions of the world. So we know now that we are gonna make a mix of different voices in the chapters available, and we'll probably need to write something about just all those different responses because all of the authors were so considerate about the issues, and we're just getting an amazing range of responses. It's been illuminating.
That's fascinating. And the issues surrounding intellectual property, just of their voices, are really relevant. I heard about on TikTok, for example, there was a woman whose voice had been sort of grabbed and used consistently on that platform for voicing people, and she had not authorized that use, and so there's a lot of intellectual property issues surrounding that. Can we use regular licensing, CC BY type or non-commercial? That's my preferred one myself, but for trying to protect that sort of thing when it comes to voices, or is that insufficient, do you think?
That's a good question. And there's a lot of debate about this now. I mean, and even the law is different in different countries like the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, like everyone's wrestling with this now. So it's patchy globally. So I think the answer is that there's no clear answer for that right now. And also, in fairness, although Creative Commons is a legal, a legal construct, just trying to fight that if your work was appropriated would be very difficult.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Yeah. Does anyone else in the audience have other questions for Catherine? Well, we've got her here to pick her brain. Please pop them in the Q&A, or feel free to unmute because we have a little bit of time here. Shauna, can you just flag for us when this session ends? I know our next one's up at 11.
Yeah,
Reaching a global audience on a global topic, global feminicide. If people are able to make it, that'd be wonderful. Go ahead, Shauna. Sorry.
it'll be at 10:30 that we're wrapping up. But I did want to comment on the equity and the importance of thinking about print versions when you're creating open educational resources. With my own open book, it was about the history of Indian residential schools in Saskatchewan, and someone who is in charge of one of the prisons said, "Can you please get that printed because our prisoners can't read it online." So it's also something to think about. It's not just remote places, but it's people who are behind restrictive or in a restrictive context that can't, get access online.
That's such a great point, Shauna. Thank you for that. And I'll share one more follow-on from what I presented already, is that in the work that we did for the National Forum in Ireland about how we could support open education across Irish higher education, we started with the UNESCO 5 OER recommendations. And the first recommendation is to build OER capacity. And we expanded that. So, in Irish higher education, our mission for that was to develop open capabilities. And if any of you are familiar with the capabilities approach, Amartya Sen's work and Martha Nussbaum, the notion of capabilities is more expansive than capacities. So it acknowledges context. So it's about supporting, building someone's capabilities given their social, educational, political, physical context. And, as has come up so much today, in the presentation and in the questions, when we know that context is so important, we just felt that notion of open capabilities was where we had to work. So thank you for giving that as a great example.
I also wanted to comment about just how interesting it is to me that when we focus on those who aren't represented in our local context and including them in the OERs that we create, we're actually shaping a global equity movement. Like that bringing those two things together is so exciting, and that's something I really enjoy about open education.
I agree.
Well, if there's no more questions, Catherine, thank you so much. I have so much to think about and absorb. We'll have the recording posted online for everyone so we can watch it again and really, pick up more as we do. So thanks for joining us, Catherine, and thank you everyone else for attending today.
Thank you so much, and best of luck to you all in your work. Onward, as they say. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joyce.
No problem. Thank you so much, Catherine. It was wonderful.